Acts 21 is where we will start back in our study of the book of Acts. Acts 21. We left off in this section, verses 31 to 33. And I'm going to back up and read just a couple of verses here before that. We know that Paul has been in the temple. He has, with other Jewish Christians, taken this oath. He has paid for their sacrifices and so forth. But he has also been out in town, and Trophimus, according to verse 29, we have a parenthetical statement there that tells us that they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And so there were those who had seen Paul in the temple. They had seen Paul walking around with a Gentile. And so they supposed, I guess you'd say, that he had taken this Gentile into the temple. And it says, all the city was disturbed, verse 30. And the people ran together, seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, so we know their intent here, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And so Herod the Great, actually before that, I think around 100 or so BC, I think there had been a garrison actually started and built. Herod the Great finished it, and it was named after Mark Antony. And but there is this fortress, and it's right there. This barracks area, at least, is right there on the edge of the temple area. And so they're very close by, and it was probably 20 feet. And so there's some steps that go up to that, back down to that level, if you will, down into the temple area. And so this is how they get there so quickly. But you have the idea, at least proposed in this idea, because you have a commander, and then he takes several centurions with him. Centurion is over 100 men, and so there's the possibility that he has 200 to 300 men with him when he goes down there. And so when the crowd who's beating Paul at that time sees the soldiers, they stop, at least for the moment, beating Paul. Verse 33, the commander came near, took him, Paul, commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. So assuming immediately that he is very dangerous, and we find in the next verses that there's also an assumption made that he is this Egyptian assassin who had other assassins with him a while back, a couple years previous, that had escaped. While they had caught some, the Egyptian that was kind of leading the group had in fact escaped. And he assumes that this is the man that they've caught. But we see here he has him bound with 2 chains, and he asked who he was and what he had done. And we made this point last week. He probably asked Paul specifically who he was, and then probably turned to the crowd and began to ask exactly what has he done. And so not going to trust that to the words of now a prisoner, right? And you find in verse 34 that some of the multitude cried one thing and some another. So much like some of the previous mob situations that we've seen in the book of Acts, when the mob comes together, some of them have no idea why they're there, but they see a mob, they see that they've captured somebody, and they want in on it, and so they run up there and they join in. And so you have from one side one thing, and some from another, something completely different. And so, well, that's not going to get it. He needs to get to the bottom of this. The commander does. And so, when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he says, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. So take him back into the barracks, which means going back up the stairs. So when he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers, probably those whom he was chained to, had to be carried by the soldiers because the multitude of the people followed after, crying out. And so they were pressing. The mob was pressing even the soldiers. And so you can imagine the situation when it gets to this point. This mob is so stirred up, so fired up. They want Paul dead. If the soldiers had been maybe just a few minutes more, he might have been dead. They were already beating him at this point. And so they want him dead, so much so that they're going to risk their own lives, even pressing as a mob up toward the soldiers. That they might get a hand on him in some way, and crying out, away with him. And so he's taken away for questioning. But when he gets up there, we find out in verse 39, he's going to ask if he can address the crowd. But before he does that, verse 37 says, as he was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" And he replies with shock, "Can you speak Greek?" And we find out why. "Are you not the Egyptian?" Now, not that an Egyptian could not have, it's not the case that an Egyptian could not have learned Greek, but very clearly it's fluent, it's his regular everyday language, and probably with no accent of any kind that he would have picked up on. But what he is missing is the fact that I thought this was the Egyptian. You're not. You speak Greek, you speak it fluently. Something is off here. Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion that led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? And so this is what he assumed when he heard that there was a stir and ran down there and assumes that he is this Egyptian. They've caught him. He puts chains on him. And so probably then to a guard on each side with chains to him. And says, are you not this man? Now Josephus claimed that there were 30,000 assassins. And Luke writes here what we'll find out, this is Lysias, that Lysias believes or says 4,000 assassins. Well, there's some kind of difference there in the number. Is that a problem? No. Luke we know to be an historian. Josephus is an historian as well. But the fact is, Luke is inspired to write this history. And so, whose history are we going to observe here? And it's interesting because critics of the Bible will immediately say, well, see, Luke missed it. The writer of Acts missed it completely. Look at what Josephus wrote. As if Josephus is the standard, right? Why is it the case that Josephus couldn't be wrong? It's just a simple question. It tells us right off the bat that there's a problem with that. But anyway, with that thinking, at least, there's a fallacy there. So there's 4,000 assassins that have been taken off into the wilderness. We knew that or we're told at least, history does tell us that when those Roman soldiers gave chase, they did run down several of them, killed several of them, but it was quite a battle. And this Egyptian evidently had certainly gotten away. And so Paul's answer to his mistaken identity, this is how he begins. But Paul said, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. In other words, we're not talking about some little rinky-dink podunk town. This is... And there's a connection to that he's going to make here, that he's going to make to the commander here. I'm a Jew from Tarsus. in Cilicia. And he's going to immediately make note of this phrase here, I'm a citizen. Well, on the outset, it could be that he has, as a citizen, he might have voting rights. But the fact that he is a citizen of Tarsus does give at least some indication that, this is who he is. So it's not he had a mistaken identity, thought you were this Egyptian, but no. All right, well, I'm going to at least listen to what you have to say. And so when he had given, let me back up, he says, so I implore you, based on this, on what you know already and what you've ascertained from me, he says, let me speak to the people. Permit me to speak to the people. And so when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs, motioned with his hand to the people, and there was a great silence. And he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, and we'll pick up there in just a moment. But backing up for just a moment, when he gives him permission to speak, very likely then has taken those chains from him. The very fact that he is motioning with his hands and the fact that they're going to actually listen to him. And so there was a great silence as he spoke to them in their native tongue. He didn't speak to them in the Greek. He didn't speak to them in the common language of the day, in Aramaic. He spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue, in the tongue of the law. And so that gets their attention. If anything is going to, this is. And it seems to quieten them down, at least for a moment. We get right into chapter 22. He says, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. So listen to my defense. Here's my answer. Here's what I'm answering to you. And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. It's amazing they didn't give him this opportunity before, right? And what you have to also remember is that we're not talking about the Jewish believers, Jewish Christians. These are unbelieving Jews, as far as Christianity is concerned, that have come and that have caught Paul there in the temple and suppose that he had taken Trophimus in there with him and so forth. But he says, it tells us that they kept even more silent. Then he said, I am indeed a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, in Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel. Who is Gamaliel? He was a chief teacher. He was a chief rabbi. And he himself was a Pharisee. But he was one of the most well-respected teachers of the law, rabbis. And Paul was brought up, trained under Gamaliel. And so we learn that actually early on in the book of Acts. And he says, going on even further, he says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus, brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law. In other words, as a Pharisee, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. Now he is appealing to their better side. He knows exactly what they're feeling, what they are going through. Paul has been part of a stoning before. Paul was called down from Tarsus into Jerusalem, maybe as a closer, as a stopper, one who could shut down this Christianity, one who was so zealous for the law, and they're going to take note of that, right? And he's going to appeal. He says, even your high priest he's the one that I went to and talked to about this. So he can vouch for me, right? So the use of the Hebrew tongue gets their ear. He proceeds about giving his own background and his own zealousness toward the law, toward God, as they are this day. He knows, again, something about them. And he says, I persecuted this way, in other words, Christians, I persecuted them unto death. I have put to death Christians, binding, delivering into prisons, men and women, didn't matter. As also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders. And so, of course, he wouldn't have just met with just the high priest. He met with the whole Sanhedrin council. And so he had their backing when he was going to Damascus with those letters to bring Christians bound back to Jerusalem to be tried, to be put to death if it so went that far. And so he had those letters, those open arrest warrants, if you will, as he went to Damascus. Here, just an interesting side note. You remember the one he's going to mention him in just a moment, obviously. He's going to talk about Ananias coming into him. Ananias even questioned, right? You mean go to Saul of Tarsus? The one who's been chasing Christians everywhere? The one who's been putting Christians to death? And so Ananias has probably been one who's been run out of Jerusalem himself and knows very well what's going on. We know that he has a miraculous ability. God's going to use miracles through him. So we know that he's had apostles' hands laid on him, according to Acts 8, verse 22 and so forth, that gives us that set way that things were done. And so Paul, as he is explaining who he is and his zealousness for God, his zealousness for the law, I have killed Christians, I have chased them down. Your high priest can attest to this. The whole Sanhedrin council can attest to this. He says, I have open arrest warrants that were given to me to go to Damascus and to do this. And it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon. And of course, we're not going to probably have time to bounce back and forth from chapter 9 and chapter 26, but those two chapters also, this is where Paul is giving his account. Luke records his account for us, though, back in Acts chapter 9. This is one occasion where Paul is going to give his own defense and kind of tell exactly what happened. And so you can put those three accounts together and you get a full picture of exactly what took place. He says, it happened as I journeyed and came near to Damascus at about noon. Suddenly a great light from heaven shone round about me. And I fell to the ground, he says, and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, who are you, Lord? He said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you were persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Now, when you put that together with the other accounts, we find that they did hear a voice, but they didn't understand. And so we can understand what's being said here. He said, so I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, arise, go into Damascus, and there you will be told all things which are appointed for you to do. And so, of course, he is going to get all of the information that he's going to need about the work that he's going to be doing later. But first things first, he has to obey the gospel, right? He's not saved just by this vision on the road to Damascus, just because a heavenly light shone over the top of him, but that's what some denominational groups teach. Because he spoke directly with the Lord, that should be a sign that he was saved, but he still has his sins. We know this from verse 16. And so clearly there was things that he would have to do. And it's interesting that Jesus didn't say, okay, this is what I want you to do, this is what I want you to do, this is what I want you to do, directly to him. No, he says, go wait in Damascus, and it's going to be told thee what thou must do. And so he was going to be given specific instructions, including, first of all, obeying the gospel. And that, by the way, even after he'd have his sight restored back to him miraculously. And some would say that, well, that's when he was saved, because he had a miracle performed on him, so we know that that's a sign from God, and therefore he had to be saved at that point. If so, then he still has his sins, and that doesn't make any sense. The logical person can see the difference in that. And so what we find is that Paul's giving his account. He says, who are you, Lord? He says, I'm Jesus of Nazareth. What would you have me to do? You go to Damascus and it's going to be told exactly what you must do. Since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. Here's what's interesting. Those others, the other men with him, saw the light as well. We're told in that very passage a few verses back. They saw the light, but they weren't blinded. Why? Somebody had to lead? Oh, that's a very logical answer. I like that. Somebody had to lead the way, right? But this was about Saul's experience, right? This is about Saul being humbled and knowing exactly who the Lord was.
I think it also just, in a kind of nonchalant way, just shows that he has to see the Lord. He has to see the light. He has to make a change in some way. So because he was blind, now he can see.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. And Jesus certainly taught that as well. And so he says, then verse 12, a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law. By the way, notice the description that Paul gives of Ananias. He doesn't say he was a Christian that was told to come to me. He doesn't introduce him that way. Watch this. He says, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there. He came to me and he stood and he said to me, Brother Saul, this is just simply, he's a Hebrew brother, right? He's an Israelite. He's a Jew. And so this is that fellowship that they have and enjoy together. Brother Saul, receive your sight. At the same hour, I looked upon him. And so we see the miraculous ability that Ananias has through the laying on of the apostles' hands. And so he has his sight. He's able to see Ananias. But he spoke of Ananias in these terms, not as a Christian, again, to appeal to those Jews that are standing right there under him that have just beat him. In all likelihood, Paul is standing there, may even having to be helped to be able to just to stand up. He just took a beating. He's probably bloody, and he's been roughed up, so probably his clothes are probably torn a bit, and he looks rough. But he has their attention. And while he has their attention, he introduces Ananias, and he says he was well respected by the Jews. And he approached me as a fellow Jew, healed me, gave me my sight back, and then he's going to tell him what he must do, right? Then he said, the God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know His will. Now wait a minute. Paul has been raised at the feet of Gamaliel. He is a doctor of the law himself. He himself is a rabbi. He is a teacher of the law. Saul was. He knows the law, right? Shake your head like this. He knows the law. But he doesn't know the will of God, evidently. He hasn't put all that together. The God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know His will and see the just one. And I like that. He was blinded so that he could see, right? So that he could see the just one and hear the voice of His mouth. For you will be His witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. Paul this is from Bob Whitten's commentary. Paul is reporting to the mob the essence of those events at Damascus for the purpose of showing that he was simply acting under divine influence, first, by his conversion to Christianity, and second, by his efforts to spread the gospel throughout the world. Because that is what God had specifically called him to do. And so Ananias says, why are you waiting? Rise, be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. All that had been done to Paul was not for his salvation, but for him to know exactly to whom he was surrendering. So the first statement that he made before he knew that it was Jesus, when he says, "Who art thou, Lord?" He knows that there is a power overshadowing him that is greater than him. He is subservient at that moment. But he doesn't know to whom he's surrendering. Now he does. He saw him. He heard his voice. He saw the just one. He heard the voice of him who was sent by God. And Ananias says, "Rise, be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord." This, alongside of every other act of conversion that we read in the book of Acts, is similar. And in fact, I often will go to Saul's conversion in talking with people because it is maybe more detailed. It at least gives us some things. We're going to find out if you go to Acts chapter 9, and you look at that, you find out that he is, when Ananias is told to go to him. Remember, Ananias is told he's been praying. He's been praying for 3 days and fasting, by the way. And if it was by those things that he could be saved, through prayer or fasting, then why did he still have his sins? And so again, there's so many logical arguments that flow from just simply looking at the conversion of Paul. But Paul's defense, this is not just for a matter of looking at his own conversion, except in this sense. Paul wants those unbelieving Jews to know exactly why he did what he did. Why he turned from them, being a part of them as so zealous to the law, why he would turn away from that and turn unto Christ. Why would he do that? Because he learned the will of the Lord. That's why. And knowing the will of the Lord makes that kind of difference in the lives of everybody that you will come in contact with. And so as we think about ways that we might be able to encourage people, ways that we might be able to teach others, I would suggest spend some time. We've walked through every act of conversion so far, and we've spent time doing that, looking at each one of those, and familiarize yourself with them. And you will clearly see that every time they're doing the same thing. They're told to do the same thing. There's nothing different there. Every act of conversion is the same. Even the household of Cornelius. And there were some interesting things that happened to nobody else except the apostles on the day of Pentecost that took place by way of miraculous things. And yet, we look at these acts of conversions for the purpose so that we can see that there is a pattern there, so that we can see that there is in fact a way unto salvation. And we don't have to be ashamed of that. The Bible is very clear. Yes, sir?
I always like that, this particular aspect of this story that, we're told in other accounts that he has demons like 3 days.
Yeah.
Right? And so, it could have been very easy for him to say, "Got your Lord, I'm starving. Let me go get something to eat, and we'll do this. We'll take care of that tomorrow." But if you look back at Acts chapter 9, it says, once he could see again, he got up, was baptized, then he took some food and regained his strength.
Yeah.
So the important thing that needs to be done was obedience, and then we'll deal with the fact that I'm hungry and tired.
Yeah, no doubt. That's a great point. And certainly he was. And surely it would have been on his mind 3 days into this fasting at this point without food. But the most important thing was the fact that he needed to obey the gospel. And he does just that. Let's continue on. Verse 17. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I was in a trance, and I saw him saying to me, "Make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly. They will not receive your testimony concerning me." So I said, "Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I was also standing by, consenting unto his death," in other words, giving his voice against Stephen, "and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him." Then he said to me, "Depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles." So we're given a little more detail here about this occasion when he had gone back to Jerusalem. It wasn't safe for him to be there, and that's not where they weren't going to listen to him. And now, after all these years, he's back in Jerusalem. Instead of listening, they beat him. But now there's an opportunity for them to listen, right? Isn't it amazing? God doesn't give up on them. Here's still yet another opportunity for them to hear the truth, for them to know the divine will of the Lord, right? And make changes.
And also, he's showing it in his over, like specifically with Stephen.
Yeah.
Because he knew Stephen was telling the truth. And so he readily admits, how horrific he allowed things to go and that he was guilty. Now, I always wonder, when he's praying for 3 days, was Stephen at the forefront of his mind, of all of the guilt that he was feeling for all of what he had done? Because that is who he speaks about.
Yeah. Yeah, he named Stephen specifically, and I would venture to say that, almost every face that he encountered was coming into mind during that time, no doubt, and still probably in many ways plagued him emotionally and mentally. It would have had to. He makes a statement. I've lived in all good conscience unto this day. The things that he did in good conscience, thinking that was the Lord's will. But when you find out that you were so wrong, made a big difference. Certainly, everything that Paul did, I think, was already in Paul as a man of God who was zealous for the law, as a man of God who wanted to teach the law, as a man of God then who obeyed the gospel, and then wanted to continue to teach the will of the Lord. Did so with that same zeal that he had before, but certainly with now all those memories and all of that baggage that certainly had to be there in his mind at some point. But we see then this is part of what. Probably much the same way where Saul was making havoc on the church. The end of Acts chapter 7 with Stephen's death, and then open up chapter 8, and he's doing the same. And then Christians are fleeing out of Jerusalem, right? And they're going everywhere, doing what? Preaching the word, right? Acts 8 and verse 4. This is the same kind of message to Paul here, as he was there and in the temple, in this trance and praying and so forth, and the Lord tells him, "You've got to leave, you've got to go. These people are not going to listen to you, but I'm going to send you far away. And one, you'll be safe from that, safe from this, but you're going to get to preach to the Gentiles." And of course, he would be known as the apostle to the Gentiles. But we see then this is how he kind of gets his marching orders to the work that he is certainly going to do. Verse 22, they listened to him until this word, and then they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, he is not fit to live. So it isn't much like what he had to say, right? Then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust in the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted against him. And so the mere mention of the Gentiles set them off again. That's what set them off in the beginning. But at least it's there. It's out. They know. He had the opportunity to give his defense. Now what we know also in the background of this is the fact that the Lord's already told him the kind of work that was now awaiting him, right? Where he was going to have opportunity to speak in front of kings, right? From higher ups, from leadership. Well, how that was going to come about was probably not at all like he imagined, but rather would go in chains. Verse 25, as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" So two parts of this. That citizenship that he mentioned earlier went a little deeper than the commander thought. And so obviously he's been turned over to this centurion. The centurion hears this: I'm a Roman citizen and I've been uncondemned. I haven't been condemned of anything yet. I'm just simply asking questions here is one thing. He hasn't been charged with anything. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Be careful what you do. This man is a Roman." Then the commander came in and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." The commander said, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." Paul says, "I was born a citizen." In other words, very likely, maybe his father had bought citizenship, but Paul was born as a citizen in that family versus having to pay for it. And so this is, they had stretched him out with the whips. They were about to get after it, so to speak, with the scourging. And this kind of stops everything. Immediately, those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. The commander was also afraid after he had found out that he was a Roman and because he had bound him. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priest and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. And so, these were not ordinary restraints as the chains before. At this point, this was him being literally laid over the scourging post. That's what in the previous verses there we've read. So at this point, here's Paul, and he is about to be scourged. He says, "I'm a Roman citizen. I haven't been condemned of anything. Is it really lawful?" So much so that you pick up on the fact when you read this, the commander says, "Oh, whoa, okay, let's back off for just a moment." Clearly, he had worries even because he had bound him and up to the point that he had, that this was going to go sideways for him. And so he is upset by this. And so he, after a day had passed, he tries to set a meeting. I don't think I have any slides further, but we're going to keep going for another moment or two here. Verse 23, then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do command me to be struck contrary to that very same law. And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? You remember that Jesus himself, in his teaching of both the common people and his teaching to, especially when present, the Pharisees and Sadducees, the leaders of the Jews, the chief priests and elders, when any of them were nearby, any of the scribes that so well knew the law because of writing it day in and day out, that was their very job. They knew the law. And Jesus would call them out, the leaders of the Jews, when they were supposed to be shepherding the Jews, shepherding God's people. They were not doing so, were they? They were not leading the people to look for the Christ anymore. No, at that point in time, they had gotten so comfortable in their ways and in their means and how things were set up and arranged, along with the marketplace and everything else that was going on. The temple was big business. And Jesus calls them out on several fronts. You're not leading the people. I am the good shepherd. And he goes through that conversation with them. I'm not like a hireling that's going to flee as soon as there's trouble. No, I'm going to be there because I know those who are mine. You remember that Jesus also in that same conversation said, I have others who are not of this flock. He's talking about the Gentiles. They didn't like that conversation either. You see, nothing has changed doctrinally speaking. This is the same thing that Jesus was teaching. The Gentiles were to be a part of the church. You go back to Acts chapter 10 and 11, in fact, chapter 11, where Peter has to explain himself. Explain why you've gone into a house of a Gentile, why you ate with Gentiles. Why would you do such a thing? Perfect that he had those 6 witnesses with him, right, of the Jews, who could give testimony as well, who could back up what he was stating. Oh, see, this is God's doing. Holy Spirit fell on the household of Cornelius while I was preaching about the death, burial, the resurrection. The Holy Spirit fell directly upon them. Can any man forbid water that these also should be baptized? And you remember in the defense of this in chapter 11, when Peter asked that question, could any man forbid water that these also who receive the Spirit, the same as we did, reference to how the apostles did on the day of Pentecost? It was a different occasion. It was a different situation. And nobody could forbid that. And they glorified God that the Gentiles had been granted repentance unto life. But they still struggled with that, didn't they? They still struggled with that. Everywhere Paul has gone, he's had to defend himself. Why is it that you're preaching to the Gentiles? Shouldn't they still be holding to shouldn't they still also, we should tack on the old law to them too, you know. We grew up under it, we had it all this time. And so Paul writes to those Galatian brethren, Gentile congregation, he says, stand fast in the liberty that you've been given in Christ, right? Galatians 5 verse 1. After he's explained exactly why the law was given to bring them to Christ. But those Gentiles were never under the law. And why would they stack that heavy burden on top of them? It was because of their prejudice and because of their zeal for the law. They couldn't give it up. And so Paul now is paying for that and was about to be scourged. And now the council has been called and now he's been struck. And Paul says, you're supposed to be a judge over the law and you just struck me? Contrary, in fact, to the law? And those who stood by, do you revile God's high priest? Paul says, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other part Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. Concerning the prophets, I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself always strive, he says, to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Paul, if you study Paul's words and his defense that he gives here, the defense that he gives even before the council, Paul's words are so logical. And he it's not just, he didn't just fly off the handle when I probably would, many of us probably would. His words are so very calculated because he's teaching. And he's trying to show why he is doing what he is doing. And that it's from God and not from men.
He also, when he questioned about, is it okay for you to do this? You know, I'm wrong. He proved it immediately. He knew the law.
Yeah.
Without, I mean, he could have stopped them before they even got to the point that they had him tied to the post by speaking up, but he didn't. He showed them that he knew that law. He was who he said.
Yeah. He was a master of the law of Moses. He was a master of Roman law as well.